Good afternoon, folks. We'll be started here in just a few minutes. If you'd like to, please introduce yourself in the chat. This meeting will be recorded, and we're excited to have a really in-depth conversation with some interesting folks doing great work here in the Northern Forest. If you're just tuning in, again, welcome everyone. Please introduce yourself in the chat. We'll be starting with a webinar in about 1 minute. This meeting is being recorded. It's nice to see that we have folks from a broad swath of the Northeast. This is great. I just saw someone that joined us from California. Welcome. And we've gone international. Someone here from Canada. Welcome. We'll start in just a minute. Again, if you haven't yet, please check in the chat with where you're calling in from and your name. Without further ado, we will begin. So good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Sustaining the Path, Trail Improvements for a Climate Resilient Future. My name is Joe Fox. I'm the Outdoor Recreation Manager here at the Northern Forest Center. And as you likely know, considering you've pre-registered for this event, the Northern Forest Center is an organization that seeks to create rural vibrancy by connecting people and the economy to the forested landscape. We've been working closely with communities across the Northern Forest for more than 25 years, and we're one of a very few organizations working across a multi-state region. If you'd like to learn more about our organization, I encourage you to visit our website, northernforest.org, and subscribe to our digest. Our organization has 3 strategies to deliver on our objectives, which are strengthen rural communities, grow forest-based businesses, and deepen forest stewardship. The development, use, and stewardship of sustainable trails are a major element of those strategies and are just part of the many recreation assets that make the Northern Forest so special. Today, we'll be chatting with representatives from 3 Vermont-based trail-focused nonprofits that led projects the center helped fund via a natural resources conservation service grant aimed at improving the resiliency of trails and decreasing soil erosion. We'll talk about their organizations, the work they completed via this grant program, and the work that still needs to be done. Before we begin, I'd like to address some housekeeping issues and talk about our run of show. First, our panelists will each introduce themselves, talking for about 5 minutes each. Next, I'll facilitate a conversation with all 3 panelists. This will be about 30 to 40 minutes. And finally, I'll facilitate a question and answer session with the panelists and the questions that you and the audience might have. Please note, put your questions in the question and answer feature, not in the chat. I have colleagues working behind the scenes organizing your questions, and we'll do our best to get to them all. So with all that said, it is my great privilege to introduce to you today our three panelists, Alyssa DiCocco, Deputy Director of the Green Mountain Club, Steve Petrik, Executive Director of Southern Vermont Trails Association, and Merrick Gillies, Project Manager at Vermont Hudson Trails. And without further ado, Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. I am Alicia DiCocco, and I'm excited to be here with you all today. The reason I'm joining you is because I'm the Deputy Director of the Green Mountain Club. Keegan Tierney, who is actually the lead for this project, is the Director of Field Programs, and he is very deep in training out in the field. I think he's doing chainsaw training today. So thanks for having me. The Green Mountain Club, for those of you who are or are not familiar, as a reminder, manages 500 miles of trails in Vermont. We are probably most known for the Long Trail, which is 272 miles. I have this little map here on the spine of the mountain, of the Green Mountains, that runs from Massachusetts to Canada. We also manage the Appalachian Trail in Vermont. We like to joke that it's the Long Trail's biggest side trail, and then some trails up in the Northeast Kingdom. My role at the Green Mountain Club as Deputy Director is primarily in fundraising, marketing, kind of public engagement, anything you would see outward facing. And I like to think of it as letting people know what we're doing, because the more people that know about the value of trail work and conservation and partnerships, the more people who care, the more people who advocate for outdoor recreation in Vermont. I got here because I have a background in environmental science, environmental education, and trails. And I use that pretty much every day in the work that I do for the Green Mountain Club. The grant through the Northern Forest Center was so amazing for us because it helped us complete a really big project, which is the Burroughs Trail Rehabilitation Project on Camel's Hump. I know we have folks kind of from all over, but put a thumbs up or a heart in the comments if you've ever been on Camel's Hump. Bonus points if you got engaged there or any major life moment happened, because this is a very well-loved, well-used trail. We have 3 alpine zones in Vermont, and this is one of them, and it's the only one that's undeveloped. So especially during COVID, this trail received a lot of use. The corridor at one point was 20 feet wide, where obviously it should have been, 3 or 4 feet wide. The Burroughs Trail is a 2.1 mile long trail, and this project was a complete rehabilitation from the top down to the bottom. And it was a really big project to us because every year it seemed like we were doing kind of a piecemeal ad hoc work on the trail, and it never really solved the issue. You would spend 3 weeks on a project and it would just get wiped out from a storm or something that came through, or work that wasn't done above where the project was. So this was really exciting to be able to partner with the state of Vermont to receive money and be able to make this project happen, and through the grant that we were talking about earlier. So $700,000 sounds like a lot of money, but for 2.1 miles, 60,000 people use this trail every year. So that kind of rounds out to $12 a person. And we anticipate that the project, or that the work that we just did, will last 20 years. So it's a pretty good return on the investment. And just a quick summary of the work that we did. This was a 3-year project. We hired a dedicated project coordinator, Justin Towers, who also hired a professional trail crew for these 3 years. We partnered with many organizations and volunteers to do it, and they spent 70 weeks rehabilitating over 300 sites on this 2.1 mile trail. So a huge amount of work, a huge amount of partnerships, and a really incredible amount of success. And we're so grateful to be here to talk about this. We do have a slide that shows one before and after of the project. There we go. Isn't that pretty? So 300 sites that we had, some of them were complicated like this, some of them were relocations, and some of them were just sort of moving drainage and talking about use patterns and sort of seeing where people go to bring them to a better spot. So that is all from me. Thank you, and looking forward to hearing from the rest of you.
Alyssa, thank you so much, and we're looking forward to diving more into that project and the other work that the Green Mountain Club does. Next, we'll pass it on to Steve Petrik, Executive Director at Southern Vermont Trails Association. Hey, Steve.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me. My name's Steve Petrik. I'm the executive director of the Southern Vermont Trails Association. I'm one of the founders. I've been involved since about 2019. I generally handle operations, design, permitting, fundraising, trail building, and pretty much everything else we encounter. I have a background in advertising and marketing and design, build, construction for large scale hospitality projects. SOVTA was founded in 2019 in support of the Ridge Project with the USFS and the Dover Town Forest with the town of Dover, with our trail network execution beginning in 2021. We have just under 300 members. We directly serve the communities of Stratton, Dover, Wardsboro, and Wilmington. We're mostly a rural community with a high percentage of second homeowners due to the high concentration of ski resorts in the area. We have roughly 5 ski resorts, with the Mount Snow Haystack area seeing roughly 500,000 unique visits to the valley every year. And you can take that number out with the rest of the ski areas to 1.2 to a roughly 1.5 million visits a year. We have been working for the last couple of years on a connected distributed trail pod network that is made up of roughly 10 trail pods, with 8 currently in the execution phase, with roughly 10 to 12 miles at each trail pod. And with the Vielamont ultimately providing many of the connections between these trail pods. The goal has been to reduce the overall operational impact of trails on the communities that we serve. We want to be a help to the community, not a hindrance. We firstly focused on developing public lands, federal, state, and municipal lands, and now we're starting to work with local landowners to make last mile connections. Currently, 3 of our trail pods are under Act 250 permits with the state of Vermont. We've partnered with the Vermont Mountain Biking Association, the Catamount Trail Association, VT Huts, the Vielamont, Kelly Brush Foundation, Vermont Adaptive, and Adaptive About Snow to build a network that is mostly made up of adaptive, family-friendly, multi-use trails that reduce physical and financial barriers to accessing recreation. The project that we worked on with the funds from the Northern Forest Center was Crosstown. Could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. The land is owned by Vail Mount Snow. It's a legacy trail network where a lot of the trails were old logging roads and socially generated trails, so not the most sustainable. It is heavily restricted under the Mount Snow Act 250 permit. And what that means is what the alignments are, where work can be done, what can be done, when it can be done. So we've had to work, very closely with the state. It is one of our most centrally located trail pods, and it needs to serve many, many different users. Our users roughly break down to about 70% foot traffic and about 30% bikes, with bike usage on the rise. It sees somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 users a month. Some of the things that we addressed through the Northern Forest Center grant was improving the overall usability of the trails. Could you go to the next slide, please? Improve the weather resilience of the trails so that they can be open longer, be used, more frequently, and are less susceptible to user damage during extreme weather events. We reduced a lot of the direct fall line alignments to better combat erosion with small minor realignments, reducing sediment transfer to the sensitive habitats. There's a lot of wetlands in and around Crosstown, and you do that through a use of grade reversals, grade dips, rock arming, trail tread compaction, bench cut construction, and just basically making sure that the water has somewhere to go and doesn't stay on the trail tread. The other thing that we worked to was reducing trail braiding by revegetation and narrowing the trail corridor, as you can see in some of the pictures. Could you go to the next slide, please? And as we move through with this project and several of our other projects, we plan to amend the Act 250 permit for an additional 8 miles of adaptive family-friendly trail, as well as 4 miles of bike optimized trail. The south side of the property is going to remain mostly green, multi-use, family-friendly trail with more technical trails remaining on the north side of the property. We would like to complete our wetland gap bridge, which crosses through a wetland, which has been approved by VTANR's Wetlands Department. Expand parking, because parking is always an issue. Currently, we only have about 15 spaces. We would like to see that be closer somewhere to 50 to 75. We would also like to provide a all persons adaptive mobility device loop that's closely located to the parking lot so more people can get out and use the trails, and continue to look ways to reduce the overall impact on sensitive habitats in the areas that we work. Thanks, Joe. And we're going to hand it over to Merrick.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Merrick Gillies. I'm project manager for Vermont Hudson Trails. Vermont Hudson Trails, and we can pull up the slides here if that works. Vermont Hudson Trails sort of has a cornerstone, keystone project right now that we've called the Velomont that hope some folks have heard of, but we're still getting the word out. So I want to spend a little bit of time introducing it. But essentially the Velomont Trail is unique project sort of that we've been working on planning for the last several, 6 or so years, that started as more of a grassroots movement to connect existing trail networks located in the central part of the state, and has expanded to a statewide effort to connect new and existing trail pods. Steve had walked through some of the ones in the southern Vermont area, and span about 485 miles from the southern end to the northern end of Vermont. You can see actually very similar graphic to the Long Trail graphic, but opposed to following the spine of the Green Mountains, we're actually really aiming to get into communities that host existing trail networks and really connect these communities as we go. And then the other arm of this project, as you can see, there's sort of some icons on the map, is we're really looking to build and support existing accommodation and construct new accommodation along the trail as well. And in the planning efforts, we've been working with a lot of partners and really sort of trying to focus resources that in areas that exist, and then direct resources to areas where there might be a great fit for new and additional trail or new additional accommodations. So we've been working on projects all the way from remote backcountry huts and remote backcountry single track to family-friendly networks in town where we can have the alignment come right to the village, and hostels in some of these sort of larger communities that can support them. A lot of work over the last several years to work on the alignment and sort of finalize where we're going to go. So you can see we have a rather broad swath painted on our existing map here. And that's really because we don't have an exact alignment for many areas. I don't have time to get through, every individual section, and we do want to focus on the area that we did the project work for this grant. But I will sort of highlight a few just to sort of start. A lot of focus, as Steve mentioned, in the last several years on work on federal and state lands. And then I also work a lot with private property owners as well. And there's a lot of this trail system that will be hosted on private lands. As part of this, we've been identifying a lot of opportunities for conservation as we identify the alignment. And that's sort of a major cornerstone of this project, is to use the trail and the trail planning efforts as a conservation tool to pursue landscape level conservation efforts across the state, and really build on existing conserved lands and identify new opportunities for conserved lands. And we work closely with the Trust for Public Land on that effort as well. So a lot of different aspects here. And as a fairly small group still, I wear many hats. So part of my role as the project manager is I work on the ground implementation. So we work with a variety of trail contractors to execute mostly grant funded work at this point, to construct new segments, perform maintenance, and identify opportunities for future development of recreational resources. I also do all sorts of other planning and a variety of tasks, and even get out and clear the trails in the spring. So we can go to the next slide, and I want to spend a little bit of time. Oh, my final point here was a little bit on my background. So I came into this role for project management from project management background in civil engineering. So I did installation of utilities across the state of Vermont for municipalities for the last handful of years, and working on a new type of infrastructure for me is trails. That's really my passion, and it's been an excellent switch and something I hope to continue with. So this project in particular that we were working on with funding provided by the Northern Farther Center was improvements to the Catamount Trail along the Somerset Reservoir. And I think this is a really great example of a project for sort of scope of Vermont trail scoping and improvements for connecting networks. So there are existing trails on either end of this section of the Catamount Trail. And the Catamount Trail presented a really interesting opportunity to link these sections of trail. So when we were working with the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service in the Manchester District, we identified this section of trail, which is actually not hosted on their property. It's on Great River Hydro's property, so a private landowner, as a section that could really provide really unique connectivity. It's a very remote location between existing resources and was a really good candidate for improvement. The sort of obstacle and management concern for us here is that this trail has been a winter use trail for many years. And while the alignment was there and there was a lot of great sections of trail, there was a lot of improvements that were needed to be needed to enable this trail to be used for multi-season use. So we identified a number of these improvements and we worked our way up from the bottom. And we have a little bit to go, but we were able to accomplish quite a substantial amount under this grant in the last summer. And I want to highlight a few of those sort of operations. We broke this project into a number of different areas of improvement. So one of the primary concerns were areas where the tread wasn't really hard enough to facilitate summer use. There's a fair amount of informal summer use that occurs on this trail. It's really very scenic. You have views of the reservoir pretty much at every spot along the trail. But with increased levels of traffic, there really was sections of trail that was not going to be able to support that level of use. So spent a lot of time hardening quite a number of these sections. There's a few images here of sort of lower, wetter, steeper areas where we're not able to build the tread up or shed the water in the appropriate manner to facilitate a more sustainable tread. This was fun because this was not a work site that you could really access on a day-to-day basis. So we actually worked with a group that ended up camping out here for 3 weeks and performed that work. They're based out in New Hampshire, so familiar with that scope of work, but a little bit unique for Vermont. We're very fortunate in this state to have really good access to most of our communities from our trail network. So it's very rare you have to spend the night in the woods to work on your trails. But that's one of the exciting parts of this project for us. So we had a group out there. You can see a fair amount of rock work done. And then one of the other larger improvements, we can go to the next slide here, was there was a section that came out of the blueberry swamp. There's a pretty significant drainage. And in the winter, skiers would just sort of cross this by hopping and skipping over. It wasn't pleasant. People apparently got their feet wet plenty. And it was really a candidate that really needed a bridge. Particularly for summer use, we didn't want people scrambling down the sensitive habitat located along the banks. And we also want to make sure this bridge would be resilient as this drainage comes up quite significantly in the spring. We actually lost a nearby bridge located north of this just this spring. So another great reason to build your bridges well out of where you think the waters might potentially reach. Anyway, so this was a new bridge, again, rather remote. So we actually ended up running a boat and staging lumber by boat, which was a great day. We got a bunch of volunteers out on the lake and the pontoon boat loaded up with lumber, made a bunch of trips, and worked with a contractor to install this section of bridge, which will be used for both summer and winter use. I think that's about covers sort of general intros. I'd encourage, being a newer project and it's sort of a little bit of a newer face in the scene. If folks are interested, we did a fair amount of planning work and there's a lot of material up on our website as well for folks interested. And feel free to reach out to me after the meeting as well. I'm looking forward to the discussion here.
This is great. Thank you all for your introductions. And I'm recognizing that there's probably add a little bit more context for the folks that are tuning in and who may or may not be from Vermont or from the region. So interestingly for us at the center, this was a grant program that was Vermont specific. So the funding came as congressionally directed spending bill from Senator Leahy before he left office, and came through again the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a division of USDA. So the other thing to give context to is, so Steve with Sovta is a VIMBA chapter, which is a Vermont Mountain Bike Association mountain bike network, independent nonprofit. Correct, Steve? Yeah, both SOVTA and VIMBA.
NCTA, Joe. Sorry.
I'm sorry?
The Catamount Trail Association.
Yes. Yep. CT. Yep. So what's unique here is we have Green Mountain Club, which manages one of the longest or the longest, oldest, sorry, the oldest long distance hiking trail in the U.S.,
You
which is the
got it.
Long Trail, which is co-located with the Appalachian Trail, which sort of kind of runs parallel and sometimes together with the Catamount Trail, which, for those that don't know, is a length of Vermont Nordic skiing trail. And then there's a Velemont project, which is a length of Vermont, yeah, mountain bike trail, essentially, that utilizes a combination of new trails, existing trails. And then in all of this, a combination of Vermont huts, maybe some Green Mountain huts, some, people can choose to stay down in villages. So it's a really interesting combination of the state of Vermont really highlighting its outdoor recreational assets and finding a way for them to kind of work together. And hopefully one of the things that you picked up here, while it's not the focus of this conversation, is just partnerships, and that's something that at the center we work really hard to form these sorts of partnerships. And it's just really interesting to hear the kind of work that you're doing. Another thing that came up, Steve, and I think Merrick, you both at least mentioned Act 250. For those that don't know, that's Vermont's land use and planning and development law that was passed back in 1970. We could do a whole other webinar on that. Long story short, it's a permitting process and a whole review process. So again, thank you all for your introductions. To set the context for sustainable trails, I think sometimes people think about, well, they're just durable surfaces, but there's so much that goes into that. Things like, elevation, aspect, the local conditions, the soil conditions, proximity to wetlands, proximity to flood zones, um, inslope, outslope, soil compaction, rock armoring, whether you're putting up bridges or culverts. So there's a whole lot that goes into it. Um, I saw, rock work that you showed in your slides, Alyssa, Merrick, that, a new bridge that hopefully, decreases soil erosion into that stream flow into the reservoir. Steve, you had soil compaction going on and outsloping. You mentioned that you were changing alignments from steep trails to adding more switchbacks to slow down water. And those are all very discrete projects. Alyssa, your project, just that one trail was what, 3 years and $700,000 on the Burroughs Trail?
Yeah, 3 years.
Yeah. So lots of labor, lots of time. And anyway, the work that you all do is super appreciated for getting folks outdoors and for protecting the natural resources that bring folks here. So anyway, this grant again was aimed specifically at reducing soil erosion, the causes of which can be many. So beyond just time and use, just like normal wear and tear, I think we can all admit that you can't just build a trail, like it has to have maintenance. But some of the things that really can exacerbate that wear and tear are things like inappropriate siting of a trail, or poor design, or poor construction, overuse, inappropriate use, severe weather, lack of maintenance. We'll kind of go through here a little panel discussion, but in your experience beyond extreme weather events, what do you think are some of the biggest contributing factors to erosion on trails? And do you have suggestions you might want to share with other land managers, trail organizations, or municipalities that are interested in developing or rehabilitating trails? Like if you were to say, so you want to build trails, you should start with this. Is there some starting point that you would recommend to folks? And feel free to jump in whenever the spirit moves you.
I would say so. Us having a mix of some legacy trails like Crosstown, newer trails like the Ridge Project, Stratton Rec area, where we're able to go in and really nail our alignments, is really having a good plan and having good alignments for your trails. Now, that's not necessarily going to solve all your water issues, because our soils are pretty wet. You'll get water leaching out. But by having, good grade reversals, grade dips, and really slowing water from going down any sort of incline, you can drastically reduce the amount of erosion. But the backside of that is a grade reversal eventually is going to have sediment that's going to build up on it. So it's going to require future maintenance. A lot of this stuff isn't you just build it and leave it and it'll magically self-maintain itself. It does require trail crews or volunteers going out and providing ongoing maintenance.
I think for us, because our trail was built 115 years ago, it's a little bit different. Even just hearing what would you propose in a new trail? It's like, oh, what's that? It's a little bit different, but I think that paying attention to use patterns is really important. So, what we saw at Burroughs with Camel's Knot, I mean, that was always a well-used trail, but it just exploded and changed. So making sure that whatever we're doing, we're not just setting and forgetting in terms of where we think people will go, but really monitoring what the use pattern is, where people are going, kind of what people are doing. And that was something that was beneficial of doing the project over 3 years, is that people, the trail crews that are out there really got a really solid understanding of what people were doing and what hiker behavior was when we were out there. And for us too, because, these legacy trails have 800 million water bars on them, and just making sure that our volunteers are trained in a way that they know what to look for, what to do, and how to get the water off of the trails to maintain it to that standard.
And I think I'll add to that too, that there's been a really big push sort of from many users in Vermont. And I know this panel and sort of the participants and folks listening in are primarily based in the Northeast, but I'd say over the last 10 years to really educate users on, when appropriate times of seasons are to use certain types of trails. And I think there's been a lot of great progress made really in that field recently. And I would say that, as someone who relocated up here, around 15 years ago, there's really substantial conversations, and folks, especially this time of year, really chat about, oh, is this a good time to go be using the trails or not? And I think, the ability to get that information out and have it readily available for people to consume is really important, is maybe one of the biggest things we as organizations can do to help manage, important use. So it's about having that information available and having folks educated enough to sort of know where to find that information about when is a good time to be out on the trails and when it might be good to have them take a break.
Merrick, I would second that as the second biggest thing, as SOVTA is a relatively new, larger trail network. One of the biggest things that we've had to focus on is really developing a culture of trails and educating the community on, hey, it just rained 4.5 inches. It might not be the best time to go out on a trail. The flip side of that is also trying to offer within the network highly weather resistant trails that people can get out and recreate on, because you can't just take stuff away. It's kind of a fine balance, but you're absolutely right. Like, the education component is really important.
That's a huge part of what I do in the sort of communications and marketing side. Is when I first started, there was a lot of I've been with the Green Mountain Club for 11 years, and a lot of it was about, mud season, trails are closed, and we kind of, that's still true, but we flipped the script a little bit and said, hike this, not that, and put it on a hiker, responsibility, and this is what you should be doing. And then we also built out networks of folks to kind of advocate on our behalf, so that it wasn't always coming from us, it was coming from people within the community. And that has made a huge difference. I mean, even in the past 3 years, since we've added some communication staff, you see in the online forums of people self-regulating and providing information, where previously we had to go in there and been like, oh, this is closed, here's the impact that even one hiking boot on this vulnerable trail can have. So it's really exciting for us to see that people who are really invested in these trails, and especially with the the increase in trails in Vermont, that folks are taking sort of like a holistic view of taking it upon themselves to see which trails are open, what is, where is it appropriate for them to recreate.
I appreciate that feedback, and I'll do a shameless plug for Northern Forest Center. We manage a program we call Ride with Gratitude. It's a mountain bike focused set of etiquette promotion, and yeah, a big part of our outreach is like, if you're leaving a rut, turn around. Basically, like pretty simple. That's one component.
Well, and
That's great.
especially with climate change and stuff, like mud season, our messaging has gone from a really concentrated area to kind of all year. So that messaging of like turn around if you see mud is ever present.
Yeah, I would agree. I think something that I know a lot of trail managers we've spoken with, and not to get us, I think we're staying on topic here, so I'm okay. But yeah, the freeze thaw, what is prolonged, and there seems to be multiple freeze thaw events. And for those that aren't aware, tuning in, yeah, those shoulder seasons can create a lot of damage very quickly on trails. Awesome. All right. Well, so moving on. So the work you did for this grant program is, I mean, it's super impressive, and it's definitely a positive step in creating resilient outdoor recreation infrastructure that minimizes environmental impact. It provides opportunities for folks to recreate. But clearly, those projects are like a minuscule part of the work you all do year in and year out. And you've talked a bit, but can you talk a little bit more about some of the other work on the horizon for your organizations? And then just for a scope of scale, like some insight into the expected financial needs to accomplish those goals in any order.
I can start. So, but do you want like what we do annually or sort of trail specific? Does it matter?
I think maybe trail specific. So in
Yeah.
terms of like the Burroughs Trail was obviously a massive multi-year, multi-agency project. Are there other, big beyond just the annual maintenance? Are there other, rehab,
Mm-hmm.
restoration projects online or reroutes that might be necessary due to land owner changes or things like that?
So Belvedere Mountain is the next project like that. And basically what is happening is that we're taking what we learned on Burroughs and applying that there and doing the entire piece that needs to be relocated because of where it is, and it's on a private land. So we'll move it onto a Long Trail State Forest, and we'll be able to have that kind of chronically muddy, wet area be able to be built more sustainably. And I think looking at projects with that bigger lens of this, Burroughs kind of gave us the confidence to say, okay, yeah, we can take on a 2.1 full restoration, or we can take on a larger multi-year project, and it makes a difference, and it withstands, I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the work that was done on Burroughs survived both the flooding in 24 and 23. So that was a really good sign to us that this work is important and valuable, and let's keep going forward with it. In terms of funding, I think that our funding is in a good year variable, and in the current atmosphere is challenging, because while we haven't been directly impacted, we are indirectly impacted in a lot of ways, because different contacts at different organizations are needing to focus on different elements, or they've been moved or restructured and things like that. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens when there is concern for funding moving forward. Every year, our annual basis is about $500,000 that we get from federal and state resources. So, anything in addition to that is usually paid for through the federal and state resources. So it just remains to be seen.
Thank you.
So for us, we're in the process of, developing our trail pods, and the area that we're in, there's a lot of elevation gain loss. So there's a lot of geographic neighborhoods, as it was. So the goal is to try and have trails located within those geographic neighborhoods and then provide connections between them so that we can lower the operational impact of a lot of trails. One of the issues is when you start building trails and trail pods and trail networks is there's a direct impact on the community and the quality of life. And we've seen this play out, at many trail networks across the country. So we're trying to roll things out in a way that allows us to make changes, implement those changes, develop more parking. But generally the goal of having a small operational impact. Funding for this, we're pretty lucky because we have an in-house trail building crew, so our costs are a little bit lower. When you start contracting out, your costs will go up. We're in the range of $35,000 to $40,000 a mile of trail. When we have the funding, if we don't have the funding, we still have great volunteers. We go out and we put the time in on trying to get some of the projects done. Funding is becoming a little more difficult. Funding's even more difficult for ongoing maintenance. You generally can find some funding for new trail projects, but to find funding for your maintenance is very difficult. A lot of that ends up coming from your membership, small donations, but that's where things you don't realize it's going to be expensive. When all's done and said, to build out, roughly 100 miles of trail in our area, we're probably looking in the range of 1.5 to $2 million for our costs. It would be, if we're going to use some outside contractors, but we're able to keep our costs again because we do a lot of stuff in-house on the much cheaper end, which means we can make our funding go just a little bit further.
I'll jump in here too, and I think there's a lot of interesting parallels at where Southern Vermont Trails Association and the Belmont are in terms of sort of planning and staging. So, we're also in a large period of growth and are, really tackling a fair amount of projects. And I think, really what we're finding is, maintenance projects are incredibly expensive, and relocating and aligning trails and rehabilitating trails is, incredibly important work that we continue to pursue. And it really shows the benefit, and we've seen the benefit of trails that we've constructed to sort of a really high standard, and really trying to hold ourselves to, build the most sustainable trail and focus on our water management first, and really trying to, make sure that we have a tread that will last a long time, really paying off for us as we sort of continue to expand our trail system between a lot of these entities, similar to Southern Vermont trails, across the state. So we're sort of, very large proponents in, building trail that, requires, there's never no maintenance, but, less maintenance in the long term, just due to the initial investment. And a lot of times, that just is sort of, to the scope and scale of which we're trying to construct. I think one interesting tidbit that I sort of alluded to a few times here, between discussions and all three of us, is that, a lot of the times the trails that we're constructing in Vermont, in the areas that, the communities are afforded recreational accesses, are probably not the easiest places to be constructing these resources. And we really, we mostly put housing where the, really good soils and, easy terrain to manage trail networks are in this state. But I think that really affords really interesting opportunities to people to, get out and experience really, unique and special parts of Vermont as well. A lot of work I do as well that's a little bit interesting is, we work with a very wide variety of regional land land managers, private landowners as well. And I think a lot of that work for us too is about building trail that will last a long time, really instills like a level of trust with all these different partners to make sure that, we're capable of, one, taking on the management of this trail in the long term, but, building something that's going to stand out and, not create any issues for whatever that entity is managing for. And whether that be, someone who just wants to walk behind their house every day and experience the trails with the public, or, be in a state park where they're expecting, a very high amount of usership and need those trails to be holding up for the duration of, whatever the recreational season may be. But yeah, I think we can probably move into some of the other ones there. I think there's a lot of interesting threads to dive off on that.
Yeah, I appreciate all the feedback there, and I'm
Mhm.
going to jump around a little bit. And in the meantime, quick housekeeping thing. Just want to encourage the folks watching, if you have questions, please use that Q&A. We'll get to that here pretty soon. We'll go through a few of our pre-planned questions here, and then turn it over to you, the audience. Just kind of staying on that funding kick, jumping around here a little bit, but uh, I think perhaps even the folks in California that are watching may have heard in the news in the past few years, Vermont had some historic flooding, and it was highly localized in certain areas. 23 seemed it was more widespread in the state of Vermont. 24, there were two very localized, very heavy storms. And I'm curious for you folks, did you encounter any damage from those storms or other random storms? Like I think they called it the Grinch storm in December of 23, 24. Um, and from that, was there any FEMA involvement, or is there still you know uh, rehabilitation funding that you're waiting on, or how has that affected your network? Is there still work to be done?
Joe, that's a good question. So last year was the flooding in the northern part of the state. The previous year was when the southern part of the state we got hit very heavily. We were in the middle of doing the first phase of construction at Crosstown. Even with soil compaction, after we had rebuilt certain sections of trail, we lost about a quarter to half mile of trail where all the topsoil or mineral dirt had just been washed away off the trail because it just didn't have time to be set up. We were really lucky that VIMBA has a emergency storm fund, so we were able to spend specifically on that an extra week and a half out there with the machine, rebuilding that and trying to patch it together. In other places like the Stratton Town Forest, there was severe, which is a very rocky area. There was severe channelization of water, which led to trail damage in places that we weren't expecting. And what's now happened is that damage has led to new routes for water, which has required more drainage and infrastructure to cope with that damage from the storm. We were able to apply for a BORAC grant to do that and maintain the town rights of way where there was a bridge that was damaged. Hopefully, we're looking to do that in the next year or so to complete that. But the storm damage was pretty significant in, like you said, highly localized areas. But thankfully, there were grants, VORAC, through the state of Vermont. They had their storm recovery, and then VIMBA had their major storm fund, which was very helpful in being able to have the funding to have staff out there working on it.
We had in 2023, there's pretty widespread damage across the trail system just because it, expands the entire state with pockets of obviously worse areas than others. And then it kind of just exacerbated everything that was already happening, right? Like Forest City Bridge in Camel's Hump was already like it was really close, and then it just we had to shut it down and replace it. And I think one of our colleagues, when we went out and were assessing the entire trail, kind of described it as it just looked like the entire trail system weathered 25 years overnight. And that's kind of what it felt like. So we do have work that is slated to begin this year with FEMA funding, and we are being flexible with our timelines because of what is happening in the federal government right now, and may have to move some things around. But there's some smaller projects, but it was a lot of money, estimated about $400,000 worth of damage. and there was funding available through the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and a couple other places, but not as quick. We don't have access to any emergency funding or anything like that. So kind of on the longer planned out, putting it into our annual work basis. And then this past year, there wasn't too much damage. There is a little bit, and we again applied for FEMA funding to get that work, you know, in the next year.
And we've been, in terms of the trails we currently manage for us are actually in the central part of the state. So we've been relatively spared the last 2 summers, sort of with major events going both north and south of us. But I think that the sort of tidbit in there that I want to share that's been, you know, really interesting for us if we've grown and developed as a trail system is working with the federal government. The Rochester and Finger Lakes district has one of the highest concentration of structures in all of the federally managed land. So that structures I'm talking about mostly bridges, but also, you know, culverts and other sort of entities that require regular maintenance. So when we originally were scoping this project, you know, there was really not a lot of flexibility for them to allow additional structures to be built. So all of our drainage crossings throughout the entire trail network that we have currently on their property are hardened crossings or, you know, rock fords. And those have proven incredibly resilient for us sort of as we've moved forward. So, you know, it's not something that's new, but something that we continue to explore. And I think when we look at terms of being like an end-to-end or, you know, something that's providing connectivity between existing networks, when you hear about these big storms, it's always like, oh, the bridge that failed, or, you know, the culvert that failed and you lost the side of the road. And when we had the floods up where I live, which is in Bolton, you know, all of our major damages were concentrated along where water crosses the tread. So that's what you're always most worried about in some of these very large storms. And by keeping to that, and sort of as we've continued to, you know, construct in other areas, it's really, you know, enabled us to, I think, create something that's a little bit more resilient. And of course, you see sediment moving around. We talked about, you know, where you might have more things open up, especially in these, you know, 5-inch rainstorms that we've been seeing. But I think that's been really important for us and something that, you know, we continue to explore. It's not, you know, if you build something that can take up to the highest level of storm, you're not worried about, you know, at what point do you exceed the 24-inch culvert that's only designed for the 100-year storm that now no longer is a 100-year storm because it's, you know, occurring at a regular interval. And then the other one I wanted to stress about too a little bit that's been interesting for us is we've been seeing these large, you know, more groundbreaking news weather related events that, you know, get a good amount of press and people tend to cover them. And that's mostly when they're inundating, you know, local communities that have a little bit more news coverage. But we also do see, and I think, you know, this is something that's always happened, but we're seeing with more frequency, you know, these small localized microbursts that really can do quite a bit of damage occurring at, you know, probably, you know, I'd say an elevated, I haven't done the research, a more elevated one. So even for us this year, we had, you know, a really random small localized ice storm that did an incredible amount of tree damage on a network that, you know, we maintain. And that's something we've seen over the last 3 years. And it's always been like, oh, it's a, you know, big year for blowdowns and there's been a lot of work, but, you know, that's now been multiple years in a row. So I think, you know, we're basically on a new normal for that. So these small sort of repeated storms, even if they aren't the big, you know, groundbreaking one, do a lot of work on a network, especially sort of in those sensitive times of year.
I appreciate that insight, and we're going to go off script here really quickly. But one of the things that stands out to me is that you can correct me if I'm wrong, but all of your trails are open to the public for free. The maintenance is absolutely not free. So, and you have memberships that are available. So can you talk a little bit about memberships and maybe give a soft pitch or a hard pitch if you'd like for maybe why folks should support their local trail organizations?
This is what I do. So thanks, Joe. I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity for folks who visit Vermont and use the trails, or folks who live here and use the trails, to think about, you know, I think there's a conception that trail work is done through state and federal resources, and it is, and it's not. So educating folks and saying there's organizations, like all 3 of our organizations, that are out on the trail doing the work, and we manage the volunteer. You know, a lot of people also say like, oh, volunteers, volunteers are not free. You have to train them, you work with them, you do a lot to support them, and everything is obviously increasing cost. And by giving to the community resource, which is the local nonprofits that support this trail, your local land trusts, things like that, you're investing in your local community, and you're investing in something that you're using and that you care about. And the way I think about it, I have 3 kids. Like, I think about the work that I do, the love that I have for hiking in Vermont, and that I'm investing in the future for them. Because if we don't maintain these trails, what will happen? And we've seen what happens when we don't maintain trails. It's not pretty. And so in order to have the best experience that we can and to protect them, supporting, looking at who manages the trails that you use and saying, yeah, I want to donate to them, or I want to join, or I want to volunteer, is a huge, huge thing. For us, we're a $2.5 million organization, and which sounds huge, but all we do, we haven't actually grown. We do the same work. Things just cost more now. But we, $1 million of that is from individuals through donations and memberships. And that is supporting the local maintenance, volunteer training, sort of all of that stuff, the matches for the trails.
I mean, I would say, what a lot of people don't see is the work that goes on behind the scenes. That's permitting, grants, trying to work, on membership programs, actually generating the money to buy new tools. Tools for the volunteers are expensive. There's a lot of work that really goes on that the public doesn't see. And one of the things that we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is really shine a light on that, where we talk about that in social media. When we talk about making a donation, we say, $10 pays for fuel for one day for a machine that's out building, or, $250 pays for one staff member for a full day of work. We try and put it in terms that users and people in the community can really understand. The other thing we've been doing is when we're doing trail work, we actively encourage users to come out and see the work that's being done so that they can get an understanding of the amount of work that goes in to building these sustainable trails. It's not just a couple of people going out in the woods with a rake, which is what historically has happened with a lot of trails. Just raking away some leaves and letting people, go run around. There's a lot of planning, flagging, and thought put into where the trail is, how it manages water. And we love having the people out there so we can take the time to show them exactly what's taking place on the trail as we build it.
I think what I want to add into sort of this vein is we have tremendous amount of winter trail use in this state, and it's really easy for the public to comprehend what they're paying for and why. And so, whereas we're not a large private entity, all of our groups here, maintaining, snowmaking and large ski infrastructure, I would say that it's easy for folks to equate even to like a small local cross-country ski effort. It's like, hey, we went and we ran the groomer this morning, and we'd appreciate if you could leave $10 in the jar. And I think that's what I try to bring to, managing mostly summer use trail networks, and the extent that, hey, you're not going to see it every single day. You're not going to see, the tread get refreshed every single morning before you head out. But the tread is getting worked on every single year, and it's getting worked on to a much more substantial degree than, running a groomer over it. And if you want to see that work ongoing and you want to be riding trails of, high caliber for us, or, recreating in various ways, this is what it takes to sustain these methods. And for us as a newer entity, I think we really, stand to benefit quite a lot from the work that's been done by a lot of organizations. And I think there's a lot of great statewide initiatives. And I even try to learn from some of our, mechanized partners as well. Like the VAST system in the state is a tremendous, use. They have an incredible large membership, and every single one of their users pays to use the trails. The trails are technically free to use, but they all are members when they get out to use them. And I think that there's a sort of culture that's absolutely getting there. But I think it's still tough. You ride in your neighbor's town, or you go for a hike. And people assume they're like, oh, someone else, maintaining this, but every single one of those assets that you visit or every single one of those trails that you're on, has someone behind the scenes, and they all appreciate your support. So I think I've seen a lot more even on the, kiosks and around at various other networks, and people are like, hey, suggested donation would be really great if you could send us, even $5 for the day, for your use. And I think that is, a very different degree, and hopefully continues to sort of grow, and the people that have the means to sort of be supporting these resources continue to direct those means in the ways that can keep these assets going for future generations.
Yeah, I think when this topic was sustainable trails, and just want to clarify for folks that sustainability is not just like durability of the tread, right? It's socially sustainable, financially sustainable. There's a lot that goes into it. Sustaining your volunteer base, sustaining the organization. That's awesome. Kind of on that same thread, your trails would not exist without land. So I think it's important to recognize that all of you manage trails or trail networks that are on land owned or managed by organizations other than your own. And perhaps you do own some of your own land, but overwhelmingly, I think you're utilizing other landowners' assets. Can you talk